介绍我们这位今天下午的贵宾First, good afternoon, and this is the beginning of the first section for the 3 sections for this afternoon. And first of all, we are welcome Professor Harold Glosser to come to our as the presenter and the keynotes in this section. And I would not to introduce too much because I know he will give us a fantastic talk. Just briefly, Professor Harold Glosser, this is not his first time to come to Taiwan. I remember the last few times he come here to supervise our Green University movement and some sustainable campus. So for several conferences, actually our colleagues in Taiwan, from north to south, many universities, we have been work together and learn a lot from Professor Harold Glosser. And he also is a very internationally well-known, I could say it's an action people because he promoted not only in theory but also in a lot of action to help the higher education and the campus sustainability in around many universities, and also one of the key persons participated in UNESCO Education for Sustainable Development. And he also, as one of the initiated member for the Higher Education Network for Sustainability and the Environment, this international organization. And also he currently serves as the university-wide campus, the President's University-wide Sustainability Committee for your university. This title I'm dreaming for. I wish our university had someone like this, and then we can do it together for the university-wide work. And this is the one, just part of his work in the Green University. The second part in his research, I also very is admirable. He is an author, and actually he's a long-time study at deep ecology. If people familiar with environmental philosophy, honest deep ecology, he's writing a lot of deep ecology and environmental values, environmental philosophy. The third contribution he also very well known is he's doing the sustainability in the eco-cultural sustainability. It's across the boundary of the learning. And also not only in the university or the school, the formal education field, social learning is one of his very important work. So if, because some student and some faculty member here, if we Googling social learning, we can find Professor Harold Glosser there. Now let's welcome Professor Glosser to give us a talk.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. I'm going to try to sort of take off, I think, where Professor Chabet and Clark and Dr. Hopkins started. And the kinds of things that I'm going to talk about, I'm very interested in theory and spent most of my work doing a lot of work related to theory, are going to be very, very practical for the purposes of this talk. So I'm not going to talk about the importance of supporting meaningful behavior change as many of the previous speakers did. I'm going to actually talk about our experiences at Western Michigan University with trying to orchestrate and facilitate that kind of form of participatory action research. So I'm going to start with something that I call the gap. And I'm going to start with a polar bear family and their mother and their 2 cubs in the far north. And then I'm going to move on to just an everyday street scene in Tokyo. And I'm going to look at sort of, you may remember back there that there was McDonald's. So these are the chickens that we take care of in quotes, to produce the McNuggets that you guys like to eat. And then this is a chicken processing factory, because that's what we have. We have chicken producing factories and chicken processing factories. And then there are a whole series of upstream and downstream indirect consequences of all the purchases that people make in the stores as they're walking down the sidewalk. And then there's a whole very significant amount of energy is necessary to produce to keep those lights on and all those offices and stores running. So the gap that I'm talking about is the disconnect between people's everyday life and how they go about their everyday life and the whole series of upstream and downstream consequences that are associated with that. That creates the disconnect between their everyday actions and their ostensible concern for the environment and the future and what we often refer to as sustainability. So I'm going to bring back our friends from Tokyo, and this time a different set of polar bears. Because when you put together those upstream and downstream consequences of their everyday life, you get the Piranha in the Arctic, which are the pools of open water that previously there was sheet ice. So the question is, what do those people do, and how does it affect the polar bears in the future? Well, I'm going to talk now about some basic information kind of on the state of the planet. And if you look at this slide, it's a relative indicator of biocapacity in relationship to ecological footprint. So the areas in green are the ones that are doing relatively well in terms of biocapacity. The areas that are brownish, orangish, are the ones where the ecological footprint exceeds the biocapacity of the region there. So you can see places like Japan, Tokyo, clearly far exceed the biocapacity. And so they're taken from Australia and Southeast Asia and all over the world to provide for all those consumer goods that you saw people purchasing. So Professor Hopkins and many people talked about sort of what those of us in, we call it sort of the more developed countries. I don't think that the word development has anything to do with what we are, but we're economically rich. Here's another very, very interesting, to me, slide that tries to address some of the issues that Dr. Hopkins, I think, talked about that really start to verge on quality of life. So there's something called the Happy Planet Index, and the Happy, can you guys see that down there? That's so visible. So the Happy Planet Index looks at subjective life satisfaction times life expectancy, so it's a subjective category, and then it divides that by the ecological footprint per capita, and you see how that plays out in terms of the Happy Planet Index. And unfortunately, we see that there's a very poor correlation, if any, between wealth and happiness. Now I'm going to do some calculations of my own because Taiwan is not part of the UN. Your friends to the north. You can see that I was able to sort of, through some other data, infer the Happy Planet Index for Taiwan. So it would rank about 84 and a score of 43.4, better than the United States. So here's another plot, one of my favorites. And this plot looks at the relationship between the Human Development Index and ecological footprint. And again, I had to do some calculations for Taiwan based upon a compilation of different data, mostly from around 2010. But what you see here is these are the so-called rich countries that have a huge ecological deficit. And these are the Human Development Index. So where we want to be is in here. So this means that you have a high Human Development Index and a relatively low ecological footprint. And does anyone know what that country is? Cuba. Costa Rica. So now let's go back to the people in Tokyo again. Basically what we see is that kind of life, if we really want to have the kind of sustainability that we're talking about, that's not really possible as we've come to know it. So the question is, and Professor Hopkins and other people were raising this issue about more technologically advanced strategies and approaches. So people talk about now green cities. So what's the relationship between green buildings and our friends the polar bear? Well, we're not likely to have a significant positive impact given sort of the hysteresis, essentially, of where we are with respect to climate change. It's not going to make the polar bears much better, especially when it's a sort of a spotty implementation of green buildings as opposed to major changes in people's everyday lives and the kinds of behavior change that people were alluding to. So that's essentially the concept of the gap. So what I'm going to get to now is this notion of what I call first order and second order change. So first order change is essentially being less unsustainable, and that's what essentially the whole discussion of sustainable development is about. Well, being less unsustainable gets us things like Three Gorges Dam, right? So Three Gorges Dam is built ostensibly to replace coal-burning fossil fuel utility plants in China. So the argument is we're having clean electricity with a whole set of other upstream and downstream consequences, cultural and environmental. Question now is, what do we mean by second order change? Well, in this case, second order change I characterize sustainability as improving quality of life for all. And all is left vague because we're talking about, as Chuck mentioned so beautifully, eloquently earlier in the day, we mean non-humans. Or I certainly do. So here's a plot, and you've all seen too much of this data on carbon dioxide emissions. James Hansen and others have called for 350 parts per million, arguing that that's the only way to have any kind of meaningful climate stability in the future. So we should go back to 350 ppm as soon as we possibly can, and that's what's sort of necessary to bring any kind of viability for species like the polar bears in the future. So is that possible? Well, it's certainly not possible with all of us coming to these meetings living the way we do, and eating the food we eat, and wearing the clothes we wear. So what kind of scale and character of change are we really going to help create? Well, this is an example, again, of first order change. So first order change strategies are sort of more of the same or something exactly sort of the opposite. In this case, we clearly have a problem with electrical distribution, but we're just doing more of the same. And it's akin to sort of applying first order strategies to a second order problem, which actually requires inherent system structure change. It's akin to sort of the definition of insanity, right? Doing the same thing over and over again, thinking it's going to yield a different result. Albert Einstein spoke about this much more eloquently, basically saying that the scale and character of problems that we've created are inherently not resolvable with the same kinds of tools and strategies that we've used to get there. And essentially what I'm trying to do is give a very fundamental critique to the Enlightenment notion of progress. Dr. Chavez sort of alluded to these kinds of notions, but I'm sort of trying to hit it head on. So the Enlightenment notion of progress assumes that with economic growth, essentially, is tagging along growth and improvement in social characteristics and a whole variety of other kind of quality of life indicators. But that's not the case. We know that all too well. So quality of life improvement is completely contingent. If you look at it in terms of a multi-criteria approach, they don't go together. They don't sort of swim in the same waters. So I'm going to try to give you an example of second order change. Has anyone ever heard of something called the Manhattan Project? So this is James Sanderson. He's the founder of it's called the IKEA Project. It's the Lenape name for My Good Home for Manhattan Island. And what Professor Sanderson was interested in is looking at Manhattan Island. He had an old British headquarters map from 1782, and that was the richest map in terms of biodiversity and what Manhattan Island was like. But he wanted to go back to 1609. 1609 was the time that first white people came to Manhattan. And he wanted to know what was the biodiversity like. So they did a lot of very interesting research, and they extrapolated back. And what they wanted to know is what kind of species existed, what was the carbon sequestration potential of Manhattan Island prior to white settlers, 1609. And then they came up with this. You guys can sort of search on the database and go to the Manhattan Project. And it might be very relevant and interesting for a place like Taipei. Because could you reconstruct the original biodiversity of Taipei? Could you look at the carbon sequestration of the region like Taipei and see what would it take to bring that back? Well, Manhattan 2409 is actually looking at just that. So it took 400 years to get from 1609 to now. Looking 400 years ahead, the question is, could we imagine having sort of the rich cultural diversity in Manhattan Island and also bring back the ecological diversity? So this is sort of the sustainable cities concept, not just individual green buildings. Does this hold water? Is it an oxymoron? I'm not exactly sure. But this is the kind of gap-bridging notions that we're talking about when we sort of talk about second-order change. I'm not a technological optimist, but it's an interesting sort of thought experiment to flesh out. People have talked about these vertical green buildings, and in fact, it's an artist rendering, but it's actually happening in Milan right now. So there are all kinds of questions about the embodied energy in a vertical structure like that and if it's really sustainable. But clearly they're going to be doing some carbon sequestration in the structure. Is the carbon sequestration balance out in terms of the energy requirements to go left? That's not clear yet. So in this question of gap bridge and sustainable cities, is that the kind of thing? These sort of second order changes in terms of how human beings as a species approach our existence on this planet. That's what's necessary realistically to bring back the polar bears. So now I'm going to talk a little about social learning as I've characterized it. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the concept of learning in the first place. And you might notice those footprints there. So I sort of look at learning in the context of social learning as sort of a spectrum. So on the left-hand side, what I call passive social learning. Passive social learning is learning that happens without any real human beings interacting. So there are a whole series of artifacts that we have, and I'll talk more about that. So we learn incredibly successfully through passive learning, but there's also active social learning. And active social learning is a spectrum also. So I'll talk a little bit about that. What do we mean by passive social learning? Well, Clayman mentioned sort of Arjan Ball's book on social learning. I wrote the lead chapter of that book. Movies or other forms of social learning, because you're not interacting with real live human beings. Watching someone learn how to sharpen knives through watching them. Could be watching just a video. iPods, right? That's a popular form of social learning. Looking at a photograph. That's what Gandhi had at the ashram. The one thing Gandhi kept by his spinning wheel was a little image of the monkey. Hear no evil, see no evil. And did anyone know what that is down there? It's a photograph by Chris Jordan. I encourage you guys all to look at his books. But this is cell phones, so the number of cell phones that are thrown away every day in the United States, which is close to 500,000. And then what do you mean by active social learning? Well, in this case, there's someone coaching, someone skiing, so there's direct interaction with a real live living being. That level of communication can't happen any other way. When Gari Bataille, before she passed away, working with the child planting trees, jazz musicians who can only play off each other in that way, outdoor experiential ed, having to put this person through this wall, so these people have to figure out how they're going to solve that problem of getting this person from this side to that side. You can all see that? Okay, so active social learning, in distinction from passive social learning, is based on real, live people interacting with each other. Now they can interact in a more or less hierarchical fashion, so you can still have someone lecturing at you with very little interaction, or you can have this very high level of active engagement in problem solving. So what happens with active social learning? How do we actually learn the kinds of things we do? Well, active social learning is not unique to human beings, because no monkey somehow learned to go to hot springs. There's something also that happens that's very critical with social learning. It can be through active or passive, oftentimes reinforced through active social learning. It's what I call maladaptation, and I think it was also sort of alluded to today, in particular by Chuck. So maladaptation, as I characterize it, is when there are actions that systematically preference the narrow interest or perceived interest of some over the common good. And this is particularly significant in the context of species-scale problems like learning how to live on our planet. Okay, so what's the connection between social learning as we've characterized it and the gap, and how does it relate to higher education? Well, I'm going to go through a couple of bullets here. So this one sort of deals with the idea that unsustainable behaviors are often uncertain and distributed over space and time. That influences how people behave, because you don't feel that directly. You don't feel it's not like your children are being killed when you're walking on the streets of Tokyo, purchasing McNuggets and buying a bunch of shopping bags full of things that you may or may not need. Those causing the effects, namely us, are able to insulate ourselves from the consequences of potential impacts. The interwoven relationships among the different effects and drivers are often poorly understood and counterintuitive. And this is something that people in the systems dynamics literature, particularly Jay Forrester, who sort of founded it, spoke about very eloquently. Society generally models unsustainable behaviors. And so what I argue is that modeling is absolutely critical to how we behave. So if we say one thing but do another, people are likely to do what we do, not what we say. And passive social learning tends to favor the reproduction of biases and maladaptive behaviors that preference the narrow interests over the common good. These are just a couple of the issues. So here's the hypothesis that I've been working under, and is also outlined in that book chapter. That active social learning has the potential to help us bridge the gap by doing the following. It can make the effects of our actions more visceral and clear. It can be useful in engaging large, diverse constituencies in open, rigorous analysis and discussion. So the idea of having that rapid feedback is much more likely to happen through active social learning. It allows for this potential of connecting action to reflection in a much more dynamic context. It particularly helps with the combating of maladaptive behaviors and closing that loop much more effectively. And it's critical that you don't just recognize maladaptive behaviors, you have to be able to respond to the maladaptive behaviors. And then sort of the Gandhian notion of modeling the behavior that we want to see. So let's just talk about what the framework that I sort of put together in terms of addressing what I call reimagining higher education. So not the reorienting of UNESCO, and I think Chuck very much realizes that sort of reorienting model probably doesn't work. So I sort of looked at it in the context of how do we reimagine higher education. I think people in Taiwan especially need to be considering this issue, given the high level of people going to college and university, but the behaviors that we have here as a country are still very unsustainable. So we have to look at content, which is what do we teach? Well, we typically do really well with data, information, and knowledge. Where we do very poorly is meaning, understanding, and wisdom. So linking them in a way that actually affects how we behave in a fundamental way. And what I argue is there's a rift. And higher education, just acting as a priesthood, makes this rift do just what it does, and it's not going away. So, what do? How do we characterize our relationship to planet Earth? Well, if we look at sort of the Enlightenment notion of progress, we tend to have this, which comes from, often Reese's old, but I sort of look at it in a different way. Right? We draw our resources from the world, and then we dump waste back into the world. The question is, Do we do that in a way that perceives these connections as unlimited, or are there fundamental limits associated with that? So this is the Enlightenment notion of progress version, right? We just, put our waste here, and we just go like this, and lo and behold. And we can perpetually create this situation where there's an infinite waste sink and an infinite source of raw materials. And we might understand that intellectually that doesn't work, but in terms of our behavior, we still behave, all of us who are flying around the world, behave as if this is the way the world was, as opposed to what Meadows and Jorgen Landers and Behrens talked about with the 1972 Limits to Growth. So how does this relate to something like core competencies? I look at the relationship in my own work between what I call human capacities, capabilities, and competencies. Well, I downloaded this from Zhongfei. So this is looking at the GE core competencies of a university in Taiwan. You don't see anything there about sustainability. So then you see these kinds of drawings on the web, oftentimes, when people are talking about knowledge, skills, attitudes, values, and many people say that we need a radical shift in values. I fundamentally don't think that we do need a shift in values, because if you ask people, do you think that fouling the nest is a good thing, that annihilating the polar bears, is that a good thing? Most people tend to say no. So it's not a matter of values, but it's linking our understanding and our perceptions and our awareness about these things to our behavior and actions. It's a complicated issue, and I can talk about it more, but I won't right now. So the question is, what does living within means mean? Does living within means mean limits? Does it mean limits on some people and not on other people? Does it mean that we should only be purchasing things that are universalizable, or we get a fixed amount of carbon and we can use it for flying around the world, and then when we're home, we have very, very low carbon input in terms of food, we walk everywhere, we don't use many clothes, we keep our house very cold, we're very warm when it's hot. So what does it actually mean? Well, these are some books that I thought might be interesting to you that sort of deal with systemic second-order change. One I'm going to look at in particular is Joel Cohen's How Many People Can Your Support? An absolutely beautiful book. And what he does is not answer that question. The question depends upon what kind of world we want. What are we willing to do? Here's another set of books. This is Chris Jordan's Running the Numbers, which a whole series of photos that look at our impacts in a beautiful way, in a way that may help us, sort of break through those kinds of lack of awareness and meaningful change in our action. Maybe, maybe not. This is Arne Ness, who Wayman spoke about. I've worked with him very closely for 20 years. And the whole deep ecology, as he characterized it, was a distinction between deep ecology approach and a shallow ecology approach. Not that people were shallow or deep, but there were two strategies for responding to what I call the eco-cultural crisis. One was willing to accept and embrace that we required second-order change. One says we just sort of modify things, we improve our recycling, add a little energy conservation here, and everything is going to be just fine. Ness said that wasn't the case. So moving on to pedagogy. So we talked about content. What does pedagogy mean? How do we teach what we teach? So do we lecture at, or do we have engaged real-world problem solving? This is from an initiative that I created that brought about 35 faculty from all 7 colleges in our university together to kind of reimagine what the university might be. First example in the United States of integrating faculty to deal with both teaching and research, so sustainability across the teaching enterprise and the research enterprise as one entity. And then context. So we have content, pedagogy, and context. Do we model our values and our commitments in the things that we do? That's the Gandhian notion. Well, this is a cartoon that comes from a wonderful sort of example of tourism, right? We see only half, right? There's a screen here. We don't see the illegal dumping. This is an example of positive change. This was one of the major education training buildings at my university just 2.5 years ago. And this is what it looks like today. So this building was able to be funded on the energy savings between that other building and this building. So that's what's paying for the capital investment.